Peter arrives in a city that's already starting to fall apart. At first, he has no idea what he's looking at. People are running, traffic is blocked, and fights are breaking out everywhere. Then he sees someone get bitten and turn almost immediately. Peter is now trapped in the world of World War Z, where the infection spreads so quickly that entire cities can collapse before anyone fully understands what's happening. The easy part is that he could probably keep himself alive. The hard part is that Peter isn't going to stop and watch everyone else die. Peter lands in Philadelphia less than an hour before everything starts to collapse. He doesn't know where he's at first. The city looks normal enough, but nothing around him matches the New York he left behind. His phone has no useful connection. There's no sign of anyone he knows, and whatever brought him here is already gone. Before he can spend much time figuring that out, the streets around him start filling with sirens. The first few incidents don't look like anything unusual. People are running from something several blocks away. Cars are trying to force their way through traffic, and police are struggling to keep intersections open. Peter moves towards it because that's what he always does when something goes wrong. Then he sees the infection happen. Someone is dragged down near the side of the road and bitten. Peter gets there quickly enough to pull the attacker away, but the person he's trying to help starts convulsing almost immediately. Within seconds, they're back on their feet and attacking the nearest person. Peter doesn't understand what he's looking at yet, but he understands one thing very quickly. This spreads through direct contact, and it spreads fast enough that saving someone a few seconds too late can make the situation worse. Peter stays above the main crowds whenever he can, using buildings and web lines to move past blocked roads, but he keeps dropping back down whenever people get trapped. He pulls passengers from crashed cars, webs infected people to walls, and clears routes through intersections long enough for civilians to escape. At this stage, individual infecteds aren't a serious physical threat to him. Peter can throw them aside without much effort, and his spider sense gives him warning whenever one gets close enough to attack. The problem is how quickly each rescue grows into something larger. A car crash traps 3 people. Peter stops to help them. That delay gives the infected behind him time to reach the intersection. More civilians panic and run in the wrong direction. Peter has to double back because leaving immediately means abandoning people he can still reach. He begins using his webs differently. Instead of trying to restrain every infected person he sees, he starts sealing doors, blocking stairwells, and pulling obstacles into narrow streets to slow the flow of the crowd. He can't stop the outbreak, but he can redirect it for a few seconds at a time, so he becomes more selective. He uses his strength when the numbers are small and saves the webs through situations where distance matters. Peter reaches the top of a building, and finally gets a clear view across several city blocks. What look like isolated violence from street levels spreading through the entire section of the city. People are pouring out of buildings, traffic has stopped moving, infected are chasing anyone they can reach, and every person caught creates another attacker within seconds. Peter can move faster than almost anyone below him, but he can't be everywhere at once. That's when he sees a family trapped inside a vehicle several blocks away, and he goes back down. Peter reaches a car before the infected surrounding it can break through the windows. He pulls the family out through the roof and gets them onto the top of a nearby building, then immediately returns for another group trapped further down the street. By now, he stopped thinking of the city as something he can clear. He's on salvage mode. Peter starts creating temporary evacuation routes above ground. He webs ladders and fire escapes into place, helps civilians reach rooftops, and moves people between buildings where the streets below are already too dangerous. It works well for small groups, because the infected remain focused on the people they can reach at ground level. But Peter's presence also creates a new problem. People begin following him. Anyone who sees Spider-Man moving through the area assumes he knows where it's safe. Groups start gathering near the buildings he's using, and the larger those groups become, the more infected they attract. That creates obvious bottlenecks. He doesn't know enough about the city to guide anyone towards a guaranteed safe zone, so his goal becomes simpler: get them off the street and buy them time. That works until the infected begin climbing. Not straight up the buildings, but one over another. Peter watches a group pile against the side of a bus while trying to reach people standing on top of it. More infected hit the same point from behind, pushing the ones in front higher. Within moments, hands are reaching the roof. Peter pulls the civilians away before the swarm can get to them, but he's just learned something important. Height isn't automatically safe. The infected don't slow down because there's an obstacle in front of them. Enough bodies will eventually turn that obstacle into part of the path. Peter changes tactics again. He stops leaving civilians on low rooftops unless there's another escape route available. He prioritizes buildings with locked upper floors, narrow access points, or enough vertical distance that a pile of infected can't reach the top easily. Whenever possible, he destroys or webs shut the route he used to get people inside. There's no long delay after a bite. Someone can be standing beside you one moment and become part of the horde seconds later. Peter sees it happen more than once, and it forces him to make decisions he normally wouldn't have to make. That's the first real challenge World War Z forces on him. Peter is used to rescuing someone first, and figuring out the rest afterward. Here, the rescue itself can become dangerous if he doesn't understand what's happening to the person he's saving. But below, roads are gone beneath moving crowds of infected. Police lines have broken apart, cars are abandoned everywhere, and every route Peter opens eventually closes again as more infected arrive. Peter finally understands what kind of situation he's trapped in. As Philadelphia collapses, Peter starts picking up reports that organized evacuations are still moving people farther northeast. He follows that route while helping whoever he can along the way. By the time Peter reaches Newark, the outbreak has spread far beyond anything he saw in Philadelphia. The roads between the cities are packed with abandoned cars, and the military is already pulling back from areas it can't hold. Peter spends most of the trip moving along rooftops and elevated sections of highway, stopping wherever he finds people trapped below. He eventually notices helicopters moving towards the coast. Unlike the civilian traffic, they're flying with a purpose, so Peter follows them until he reaches one of the evacuation areas still being used by the military. That's where his situation finally changes. Soldiers have already heard reports about someone in a red and blue suit pulling people out of infected streets. Peter doesn't have identification that means anything in this world, but nobody needs much convincing after watching him carry 2 injured people to safety and cross a building without using the stairs. He's taken to the same naval fleet where Jerry Lane and his family have been brought after their escape from Newark. Peter doesn't immediately become part of Jerry's mission. From the military perspective, Peter is useful, but he's also an unknown person who appeared in the middle of a global emergency wearing a mask. Peter can't explain where he came from without sounding impossible, and there's no record of Peter Parker or Spider-Man anywhere they can check. He's spent hours close to the infected and has already noticed how consistent the transformation is after a bite. He's also seen how quickly a small group can become a swarm once the infection gets into a crowded area. Jerry has been collecting similar information from every source available to him, and Peter becomes another eyewitness with an unusual advantage. He's been able to stay close enough to watch the infected without being forced to run immediately. The United Nations team is preparing to send Jerry to Camp Humphreys in South Korea, where one of the earliest reports mentioning zombies came from. A young virologist, Andrew Fosbach, is being sent with him because they still don't know what the infection actually is or where it started. Peter volunteers to go. Camp Humphreys proves almost immediately that his presence can change more than casualty numbers. The team arrives in darkness and is attacked while leaving the aircraft. In the original chain of events, Fosbach panics while trying to get back on the plane, slips on the wet ramp, and accidentally fires his own weapon into his head. Fosbach panics while trying to get back onto the plane and loses his footing on the wet ramp. Peter sees a gun coming up as Fosbach falls and reacts before it can accidentally fire into him, catching Fosbach and knocking the weapon away. He survives. It's a small moment compared to everything happening around them, but it changes Jerry's investigation immediately. Instead of losing the scientist who was supposed to help him understand the pathogen within minutes of arriving, Jerry now has Fosbach with him when they reach the soldiers inside the base. They still don't find the origin they were hoping for. The soldiers explain that the infection appeared at the base after a doctor came into contact with an infected soldier, and the information available is too limited to tell them where the wider outbreak began. The more useful lead comes from the imprisoned CIA operative at the base. Israel has reacted before most of the world understood what was happening, building its defenses around Jerusalem while other governments were still trying to decide what they were dealing with. Jerusalem is the first place Peter has seen since arriving in this world that appears capable of surviving. The walls have kept the infected outside, soldiers control the entrance, and refugees are still being allowed into the city. After watching Philadelphia and Newark disappear into chaos, Peter can finally see what organized preparation looks like when it happens early enough. Jerry meets Jurgen Wormbrunn, the Mossad official responsible for acting on intercepted reports about the outbreak. Wormbrunn explains how Israel heard references to Indian troops fighting what appeared to be zombies and treated the warning seriously enough to prepare before the infection had reached them. Fosbach is interested in the biology of the infection. Peter is more interested in its behavior. He's already learned that fighting the infected individually doesn't tell him much, so he watches how they move when they're outside the walls. They don't wander without purpose. When something draws their attention, entire sections of the crowd reacts and moves towards it. That becomes important when the refugees inside Jerusalem begin celebrating loudly. Peter notices the infected changing direction before most people inside understand what's happening. Thousands begin pressing towards the same section of the barrier. The first bodies hit the wall and disappear beneath the ones behind them. Then the pile starts rising. Peter gets there before the infected reach the top, but there's nothing he can do that solves a larger problem. He can pull infected away from the highest point and web sections of the pile together, but more bodies keep arriving from behind. Every layer he removes is replaced almost immediately. The wall was built to stop a crowd pushing against it. It wasn't built for a crowd that could turn itself into a ramp. Peter warns the soldiers around the breach and starts getting civilians away from that section before the infected begin pouring over. That warning saves people who would have still been standing nearby when the walls fail, but it doesn't save Jerusalem. Once the infected reach the other side, Peter stops trying to hold the wall. He moves through the streets ahead of the swarm, pulling people from alleys and carrying injured civilians towards routes that haven't been cut off yet. Jerry, Fosbach, and the Israeli soldiers assigned to them are trying to reach an aircraft before the city becomes impossible to leave. Peter rejoins them when the route starts collapsing. This is also where Jerry notices something Peter hasn't been looking for. In the middle of thousands of people running from the infected, certain people aren't being attacked at all. Jerry sees an elderly man left alone as the infected rush past him. Later, he notices them ignoring a sick-looking boy as well. They don't have time to investigate it in Jerusalem. One of the soldiers escorting Jerry is bitten on the hand during the escape. Jerry reacts immediately and amputates her hand before the infection can spread far enough to turn her. Peter helps get her away from the swarm while the others continue towards the aircraft. He gets Jerry, Fosbach, and the wounded soldier to the aircraft. Jerusalem still falls behind them, but the group leaving it is no longer the same one that escaped in the original timeline. The plane gives Peter the first quiet stretch he's had since arriving in this world. Segan is alive, but she's weak from blood loss. Fosbach helps treat her while Jerry goes over what he saw in Jerusalem. The infected had moved straight past people who should have been easy targets. Jerry had noticed something similar before, but Jerusalem gave him enough examples to believe it wasn't random. Fosbach starts working through possible explanations with him. Age alone doesn't fit, neither does physical weakness. Some injured people are attacked while others are ignored, which suggests the infected are responding to something more specific. Fosbach has experience working through biological problems under pressure. He starts separating what they actually know from what they're assuming. The infected attack healthy people almost immediately. They don't appear interested in feeding. Their behavior is focused on spreading the infection, and the people Jerry saw being ignored all appeared physically unwell in some way. That gives him a theory, but not proof. Jerry contacts the pilots and changes their destination to Cardiff, where a World Health Organization research facility may have the equipment and medical medical staff needed to test it. They never get the chance to finish the discussion. The zombie has gotten onto the aircraft. The first infection happens away from Peter, deep enough inside the cabin that his spider sense doesn't give him a useful warning until the danger starts moving towards them. By then, passengers are already screaming, and the infection is spreading from row to row. Peter moves before Jerry can reach for a weapon. The small cabin works against him. He can't swing. There's almost no room to maneuver, and every passenger between him and the infected becomes someone he has to avoid hurting. Peter webs the first infected to the ceiling and forces his way farther down the aisle, but another passenger turns behind him. Then another. The same speed that destroyed the streets of Philadelphia become much worse inside an aircraft. There's nowhere for the passengers to run, and every person who gets caught adds another infected body inside the same enclosed space. Peter starts pulling uninfected passengers over seats and towards the rear of the plane while using webbing to clog the aisle behind them. For several seconds, it works. Then one of the infected comes over the seats instead. Peter catches it by the throat before its teeth reach a passenger, but another grabs his arm from the side. His spider sense fires again as a third lunges towards the exposed part of his neck. Peter twists away just before the bite lands. It's the closest he's come to dying since the outbreak began. The infected can't overpower him individually, but the cabin has taken away most of the space that normally lets him use his speed. Peter throws the attackers backwards and tears one of the overhead panels loose, using it to block part of the aisle while Jerry gets Segan further away. More infected are already coming through. Peter can hold the passage for a while. He can't guarantee that none of them will get around him, and there are still passengers turning on both sides of the barrier. Jerry sees that before Peter does and finds a grenade. Peter understands what Jerry is planning and uses his webs to secure himself, Jerry, Fosbach, Segan, and as many nearby passengers as he can to fix parts of the aircraft. Jerry detonates the grenade. The blast tears open the side of the plane. Air, debris, bodies, they're all ripped towards the opening as the cabin depressurizes. But Peter's webbing keeps the section from being emptied with it, but the aircraft is badly damaged and starts going down. Peter can survive impacts that would kill an ordinary person, but the people around him can't. He webs Jerry, Fosbach, and Segan tightly into their seats, braces himself against the aircraft, and adds web lines anywhere he thinks they might help keep the cabin from breaking apart around them. Peter wakes up inside the wreckage. His suit is torn in several places. His body hurts, but he can move. The same can't be said for most of the passengers. Jerry is badly injured but alive. Segan survived as well. Fosbach is unconscious several rows away, still held in place by the webbing Peter used before the crash. Peter gets to him first. Fosbach is breathing. He pulls the three of them out of the aircraft and finds that they've come down close enough to Cardiff to continue towards the WHO facility. Jerry can barely walk, so Peter carries him for most of the distance, while Segan and Fosbach follow as best they can. By the time they reach the facility, Jerry's injuries have caught up with him. The WHO staff takes all four of them inside. Jerry requires treatment and remains unconscious for days, just as he did after the crash in the OG timeline. Peter doesn't need the same recovery time, which means the investigation doesn't stop while Jerry is unconscious. Fosbach is able to explain what they were working on before the plane went down, so Peter doesn't argue that they've solved anything. He asks what would have to be true for the theory to work. If the pathogen depends on living humans to spread, then attacking a host who's already seriously ill could be a poor use of that host. That would mean the infected aren't simply responding to movement, sound, or proximity. They're detecting some signs of whether the person in front of them is suitable. The WHO facility gives them records, samples, and people who can compare Jerry's observations against cases from other outbreaks. They start looking for reports of infected behaving strangely around hospitals, elderly patients, and people with serious illnesses. The pattern isn't perfect, but it's strong enough to keep testing. Now they need to prove it. The problem is that the pathogens they could use for a test are stored in another section of the facility, and part of the building is infected wandering through it. In the OG timeline, Jerry has to enter that section himself with Segan and one of the WHO doctors. Peter changes that immediately. There's no reason to send Jerry. Peter can move through the building faster. He can climb across walls and ceilings, and his spider sense gives him a much better chance of reaching the storage room without being bitten. The damaged web shooter limits how much webbing he has left, but he doesn't need much if he can avoid contact. Peter just needs to get the samples back so they can find out whether Jerry is right. Peter enters the infected section of the WHO facility alone. This is one of the few places where his usual advantages don't help as much as they did outside. There's no room to swing, the hallways are narrow, and he can't afford to make enough noise to draw every infected person in the building towards him. With one web shooter damaged, wasting web fluid on fights would also leave him with fewer options if something goes wrong, so Peter avoids fighting wherever he can. He moves across ceilings and upper walls, staying above doorways, and out of the infected's normal line of sight. His spider sense gives him warning whenever one wanders too close, but the goal isn't to test how many he can get past. He only needs to reach the storage area, retrieve what the WHO team needs, and get back. That works until he reaches the lab. Several infected are moving through the room between Peter and the storage cabinets. He can get around them, but opening the cabinets and searching through the samples will take time. Peter waits until they spread apart, drops behind one of the counters and starts checking the labels. He finds them and loads several options into a medical case. Getting back out is harder. One of the infected enters the lab while Peter is still packing the samples. His spider sense warns him before it reaches a counter, and Peter moves onto the ceiling without letting it touch him. Another infected follows the sound, then another. Peter could knock all of them across the room, but doing that would bring more. Instead, he webs a door shut behind the first group and slips into the corridor before the rest can surround the room. For most of the return trip, that's enough. Then an infected comes through a doorway directly below him as another approaches from the opposite side of the hall. Peter moves between them, but the med case catches against the door frame and slips out of his hand. Luckily, he catches it before it reaches the floor. The movement puts him close enough for one of the infected to lunge. Peter's spider sense gives him the warning, but he can't simply jump away without dropping the samples. He blocks the infected with his forearm, turns its head away from him, and throws it into a wall. Peter retrieves a case and gets back to the secure section. Now, Jerry's theory can actually be tested. Fosback helps the WHO doctors identify a pathogen they know they can treat if the theory works. There's no time for a normal trial, and Jerry refuses to ask someone else to take the risk of a theory that he helped build. He volunteers himself. Peter begs to volunteer instead, but Fosback and Jerry said no. There's no reason to assume his altered physiology would respond to the disease the same way an ordinary human would. Using Peter could ruin the test before it starts. Once the infection has had enough time to produce symptoms, Jerry is brought close enough to the contained infection for the reaction to be observed. The infected rush towards the healthy people around him, then pass by him. The camouflage works. With the hypothesis finally proven, the WHO can begin turning that single desperate test into a controlled protocol using treatable pathogens. The infection has a weakness, but it isn't a cure. The zombies are still infected, the cities they've taken are still lost, and billions of people remain in danger. What humanity now has is a way to stop looking like a target. What Peter really changed was the speed at which all of this could be proven. Fosback survived South Korea. The group reached Cardiff with another scientist who already understood the theory, and Peter could retrieve the samples without forcing Jerry to gamble his own life inside the infected section of the facility. The WHO begins preparing the information for distribution. For the first time since Peter arrived, humanity has something it can use. Until now, almost every rescue has forced him to work around the same problem. Civilians attract the infected, which means moving people through an occupied area usually creates another swarm. The new treatment changes that. If survivors can be temporarily infected with a curable disease, they can pass through groups of zombies without immediately being attacked. Peter still can't fix what's happened to the people who've already turned, but he can start reaching places that were effectively cut off before. The first priority is getting the discovery out of Cardiff. The WHO sends the findings to the governments and military forces that are still functioning, along with instructions for using treatable illnesses as camouflage. Jerry stays involved in that effort, while Fosback works with the doctors on making the process safer and easier to repeat. He can cross infected areas without needing roads, and now the people he's escorting don't immediately draw a horde towards them. That means he can reach hospitals, shelters, and isolated groups that would have been almost impossible to evacuate earlier. The difference is obvious the first time he moves a group through an infected street. Peter helps wherever his abilities matter most. He reaches trapped med teams before normal rescue units can get to them. He carries medicine across collapsed routes. He retrieves equipment from buildings surrounded by infected, and helps evacuate people from upper floors without forcing them back through the streets. At this point in the timeline, Peter suffered tremendous psychological trauma. He's a hero after all, and his world was much lower stakes. After watching so many people die that he couldn't save, he's completely messed up in the head. But he's still doing what he can, fighting, keeping going, so that he can help at least one more person. So, could Spider-Man survive World War Z? Probably, but not because the infected stopped being dangerous. Peter has too many ways to avoid getting trapped under normal circumstances, and Spider Sense makes a successful bite much harder to land. If he only cared about keeping himself alive, he could stay away from population centers and avoid most of the outbreak entirely. Most of his danger comes from people he refuses to leave behind. Every rescue puts him back near the infected, and World War Z spreads quickly enough that one mistake could still end with Peter getting bitten. What changes the outcome is that Peter doesn't spend the entire outbreak fighting zombies. His presence keeps Fosback alive, gives Jerry another person capable of studying what the infected are doing, and makes a Cardiff test much less dangerous. He also saves thousands of lives, so Spider-Man would survive it, and because he was there too, a lot more people probably would as well.